Hello YouTube chess lovers and my friends, this is Gunjan here and welcome to the third part of my chess repertoire against the e4. Now in this section, when your opponent plays d4 and you reply with the move e5, you are going to learn what you should do after your opponent plays d cross e5. Well, here certainly black should capture that pawn, so knight cross e5, and you can see I have highlighted by the arrows over here, white has a 4 good genuine reply. So let's see each reply by turn. So the first move which I want to see is knight to f3. After knight to f3, black should certainly play queen to f6, and by playing this move order, black has created the first threat of the game. So if white does not respond accurately, then white pawn will be crippled, and that will be a great asset, especially in the endgame. So in a way, white has to deal with that threat. So there are two ways to deal with this. So let's look at the first option, which is the but obvious one, bishop to e2. So not only protecting the knight, but planning to castle on the king side. Well, against this, there is a very good move that more often you will play in this line, which is bishop to b4 check. Now after bishop to b4, white has a 3 replies, but amongst those, bishop to d2 is the worst of all, because it's just one kind of trap in this line. After bishop to d2, black has a wonderful reply which start with knight cross f3 check, and after bishop cross f3 we have queen cross b2, and not only black emerge with her pawn but with a very superior position. So there is one trap that white should avoid. So in a way, white has only 2 reply, either c3 or knight b to d2. One or the way it will transpose to each other. So let's see the first reply, which is the c3, and here black should certainly play bishop to c5. You see the first merit of bishop to b4 check. So in a way, it will take away the square for this white knight to go to the c3. That means this knight has to passively go to the either d2 or the a3. And let me reveal the theory at this point. So what black is aiming in this kind of positions are, let's say your other knight goes to the e7, then you play d6, so free up the other bishop, then the knight goes to the g6, and after simple castle on the king side, you can see I have highlighted by the arrows, what black wants is either this bishop goes to the g4 or the d7, depending on the circumstances, and this knight will slot into the f4, and black will slowly go for the king side attack. And that is the pretty much plan of the black if white does nothing and sit passively. Of course, you will see in your game many of your opponent will disturb this plan, but we will see from my games how we are going to counter those. So in my first game at this position, my opponent castled on the king side, and I played as usual per our theory, knight to e7, and now my opponent plays knight cross knight. So his idea is very simple. After queen captures, he plays knight b to d2, and after I castle on the king side, please note white cannot play knight to f3 because the e4 pawn hangs, so my opponent plays king to h1. And you have to use to this kind of moves by the white, because if anyway white wants to retain his advantage, then he has to look out for the move f4. It's a one kind of space gaining move which white is always play sooner or later. So in this game, of course, my opponent was very high rated, so he knows this plan, so he decided to play for the f4 immediately, and I responded with knight to g6, stopping the f4 move, and now my opponent plays queen to c2. So probably his idea is to play knight to f3, because now that e pawn is protected. I played d5, so attacking one more time to that pawn and stopping the knight to f3. So he renewed the threat after bishop to d3. I played bishop to d6. So bishop to d6 has a direct threat to checkmate white on h2. And please note, if my opponent played knight to f3, then the very simple reply will be queen to a5 followed by bishop to g4, and capturing that knight and once again creating the threat. So knight to f3, it's not at all a good move after bishop to d6. So instead my opponent plays g3, so dealing with that mate threat. And here I first of all played bishop to h3, so gaining time on the rook, and after rook to e1 I played rook f to e8, so once again pressurizing that pawn. And the other idea of rook to e8 is I want to provoke him to play f4, and which in fact he did. So he played f4 here, and I was waiting for this movement because I can capture that pawn. So after g cross f4 and queen cross f4, again I have created the mate threat. So my opponent defended with very logically, so rook goes to the e2, but afterwards I capture the pawn, and after white recapture I play bishop to g4, once again attacking the rook, and after only reply left for the white rook is rook to g2, I played f5, so once again attacking the bishop. And in the game my opponent gave me this check, and after I put my king on h8, he responded with knight to f3, which looks very logical because it creates a discover attack to my queen, but my opponent completely overlooked my next move, which is queen cross f3. Now queen cross f3 has a big merit. First of all, it gain a piece, it's pinning this rook, and not only that, it's also threatening to capture this bishop. And here my opponent miscalculated this line, and he simply captured my queen, which allows me to give this check. So rook check, and after the only reply rook to g1, I capture that bishop, once again a check, and the only reply forced is queen to g2. Afterwards I played a very strong move, which is rook to e2. Of course this was a blitz game, and because of the time trouble he played this horrific move, which is queen cross f3. Afterwards I simply checkmate him. That is one game which illustrate how you can handle when your opponent plays bishop e2 and c3. Now in the second game my opponent, instead of c3, played knight b to d2, and my opponent was really high rated. He was around 2100 plus, and I responded with, as per our usual theory, knight to e7, and he plays c3. So I told you it's more or less transposed to our main line, so I played bishop to c5. And please remember there is a one nasty trap exists here. So if your opponent feeling very aggressive, and if he decided to play this move, which is b4, then black has a fantastic reply, which is bishop cross b4. Please note, if c cross b4, then after knight takes comes with a check, black can simply snap up that rook. So black will be an exchange up. So that's why c cross b4 is not possible. In the game my opponent responded with queen to b3, but then again comes the second dazzling sacrifice, which is bishop cross c3. And please note, again the queen cannot capture the bishop because of the knight cross f3 check. In the game my opponent plays rook to b1, but after knight cross knight and bishop cross knight, I remain a couple of pawns up straight away in the opening. So I won this game quite easily. So that is one trap if your opponent plays b4. Of course my opponent was very high rated, so he castle over here, and after I plays d6, which free up that bishop, he responded with the move knight to b3, attacking my bishop. So I drop my bishop back to the b6, and after he plays king to h1, which is a very cunning move. What's his idea is, he first of all wants to capture this knight, and when queen recaptures he wants to play f4. So as I told you, you have to use to this scenario where white will unpin that f pawn and goes for the f4. Here I diffuse his plan with this wonderful move, which is knight cross f3, and after bishop cross f3 I simply castle on the king side, and now my opponent plays bishop to e2. So more or less he just want to push the f4. That's fine, but in this process he lost one important tempo, and that proves very sufficient in the game. Here I responded with queen to e5. This is one of my own recommendation. Whenever white is looking for f4, you should always pressurize the e4 pawn, and you will see how effective this can be. So in the game, my opponent responded with queen to c2, defending that pawn, and I renew the threat once again by playing f5. My opponent desperately defended that pawn with bishop to d3, but after very simple f cross e4 and bishop cross e4, I played bishop to f5. I just want to exchange the pieces because I know my position is very good for the endgame. So here my opponent captured this bishop, and after queen captures, he once again captured my queen. And after knight cross f5, my opponent plays a slightly mistaken move, which is f3. So his idea is very simple. He wants to free up that rook because that pawn was attacked by the bishop. But in this process, he allowed my rook to come to the 7. So I simply played rook a to e8, and after bishop to g5, which is again a big mistake. It doesn't look like a mistake at this point, but you will see in a minute why it's a big mistake. So I simply played rook to e2, so attacking the b2, and my opponent defended with rook to b1. But after very simple h6 by black, please note the bishop cannot go to the h4. So in the game, my opponent responded with bishop to d2, but now comes the whole idea, which is knight to h4. Please note this bishop, this vital bishop, is covering all these critical diagonals. That means this rook cannot support this g pawn, and if the g pawn is not supported, then how the hell on the earth white will save that pawn? In the game, my opponent responded with g3, but after very simple knight cross f3, I have two threats, which is first is checkmate the white king on h2, and the second is to capture this piece, and white cannot avoid both the threat. So my opponent resigned over here. Now after black plays queen to f6, the other option for the white is to first of all capture this knight. So knight cross e5, and after queen cross e5, you can see right now white pawn is attacked by the queen, so white has a too good reply. So the first option which I need to cover is knight to c3, so trying to defend that pawn. And here the but obvious logical reply by the black will be bishop to b4, so pinning that knight and renewing the threat of capturing that pawn. And here in one of my game, my opponent responded with bishop to d2, and I responded with knight to f6, and then he plays bishop to d3. Now please note here, if you want to play a very aggressive chess, then you can go for the d5, but to be honest with you, personally I don't like that line because your king and a queen is in line. It's okay that black can win a white pawn, but then most likely white will castle on the king side and the rook will come on the e file, and that can sometimes proves very disaster for the black. So what I recommend over here is instead of d5, you should play here d6, a solid enough move. And in the game, my opponent responded with castling on the king side, and I played bishop to g4, attacking the queen, which he defended with f3. So f3 is not only defending the queen, it's also protecting the center, and the good thing is right now it's also attacking the bishop. So here first of all I played bishop to c5 check, and after king goes to the h1, I played bishop to d7. Now as I mentioned in my earlier games, you have to use to this move, which is f4, so attacking the queen and gaining space in the center. Here black should play queen to e7, which I did, and my opponent responded with queen to f3. If you can see, this is a dream position for the white because not only its two rooks are connected, but white pieces are actively placed, and also white has a center. Now first thing you should look out is where these bishops are looking at. So if you look at these bishops are strongly looking on the king side, and also white has a center somewhat on the king side. So considering all these factors, black has to decide which side he wants to castle. Now if you castle on the king side, then all these attacks comes into the picture. So by evaluating this position, I decided to castle on the queen side, and my opponent responded with bishop to e3, so neutralizing this bishop. So I capture that bishop, and after queen captures, which has a merit of attacking my a pawn, so I just defended with king to b8, and now my opponent plays a4. So going for the pawn storm on the queen side. Now here I responded very energetically. So it's very important, if your opponent is playing on the flank, you should always play in the center, and that's what I did. So I played d5. So please note that pawn is right now pinned. Opponent decided to grab more space and he plays e5, and I responded with knight to g4, attacking the queen, and the queen dropped back to the f3. Now I played d5, attacking the knight. Please note, knight to d5 can be successfully made by queen to h4. So in the game my opponent decided to play knight to e4 and I played f5. And again, if he would to capture this pawn with en passant, then I will recapture with the g pawn, and in that case my g file will be open up, and that will be great for attacking chances. So my opponent plays knight to g5, and after h6 the knight drop back to the h3. And if you look at the last few moves of the white, all the white was doing is the knight dance. So this knight was come from c3 to e4 to g5, and now it goes to the h3. But meanwhile, during this whole process, white has weakened up this juicy e3 square, which I explored magnificently. So I played first of all knight to e3, attacking the rook, and after rook to e1 I played bishop to c6, and now you see the dark side of that knight moves. So not only this bishop is attacking the queen, but this knight and bishop are attacking the loose g2 square, which white is hard pressed to defend. In the game my opponent plays queen to e2, but after very simple bishop cross g2 and king to g1, I simply snap off that knight. And if you look at this position, black has a wonderful extra knight posted on e3, which has supported by extra pawn on d4. So that is one game which will give you an idea how you can play when your opponent play knight to c3. The second good reply for the white at this position is bishop to d3, so defending that pawn. And here black should certainly play bishop to b4 check. And again, white has few choices. Now if your opponent plays bishop to d2, then very simple will be queen cross b2, and again black will emerge with a pawn up. So that we have seen already in the last games. So in this game my opponent responded with c3, and I simply drop my bishop back to the c5, and now my opponent castle on the king side. Here I played knight to f6, attacking the e4, and my opponent responded with king to h1. So as I mentioned, and I'm mentioning again and again, white moves order are leading to the play f4. So here I place d6, no need to worry, and indeed f4 is coming, and whenever f4 is coming in this line, the queen is better placed on e7. So remember this move, you should play the queen to e7, and after knight to d2, here I place castling on the king side. It is very dangerous to go on the queen side castle, because you can see white has already committed c3, and sometimes when you castle on the queen side, then the b4 and a4 come in a flash. So that's why it's not wise to castle on the queen side when your opponent plays c3. So that's why I decided to castle on the king side. Now here I have two games for you. In the first game my opponent plays queen to f3, where I played bishop to d7, and after b4 attacking the bishop, my bishop simply drops back to d6, and after a4 I simply stop that pawn to go further with the move a5, and now my opponent blocked the queen side with the move b5. But can you believe this, that game is about to over? It looks unbelievable, but you will see in a minute what kind of disasters are looming to the white. So what I did here is played knight to g4. So you can see my idea is very simple. My knight wants to jump to the e3 square, where it has been centralized very well. And to diffuse this threat, my opponent plays knight to c4, which looks very logical, because not only it's stopping knight to e3, but this knight is also capturing this good bishop. So what's wrong about it? Can you guess black's next move? I give you a few seconds. Can you identify amazing move by black? And that move is knight cross h2. Bam! And first sight it looks impossible because can't white can capture that knight. Now please note this knight is right now attacking queen and a rook. So the white reply is pretty much forced. White cannot capture this knight. If white capture this knight, then that leads to the losing the queen, because you can see that king does not have any space to hide. So white has to forcefully play queen to h3. Afterwards black will simply snap up that queen. So that's why king cross h2 it's impossible. So in the game my opponent decided to play queen to h5 and give up the exchange. So I simply capture the rook, and now he plays this e5, a cheap threat to checkmate me on h7. But again, this was a blitz game and my opponent completely overlooked this move, which is knight to g6, forking a king and a queen, and that's the end of the game. In the second game at this position, instead of last queen f3, in this game my opponent decided to gambit a pawn for the initiative. So here my opponent plays e5, attacking the knight, and after captures and queen captures, white's idea is to play knight to f3, gaining time on the queen, and more pieces are coming towards my king. So here black doesn't need to afraid, and in the game I found out a wonderful move by the queen, which is queen to h5. So if the knight moves, then I can simply exchange the queen. So my opponent plays over here bishop to f4, and I further increase the pressure on the knight with bishop to g4. My opponent drops his bishop back to e2, and now I simply play rook a to d8, attacking the queen, and after queen goes to the a4, I centralize my another rook, which is rook f to e1, again attacking the piece of white. And in the game my opponent defended the bishop with rook a to e1, but he completely overlooked my this move, which is rook to e5. So it's attacking queen and the bishop, and white cannot defend both the pieces. Now the third option here is knight to d2, which was the case against one of my opponent, which is very high rated, around 2200 plus on chesscube. So here I responded with knight to f6, and here my opponent castled on the king side, and I played d6, and now he plays f4, so attacking my queen. As I told you in my previous video, whenever white plays f4, you should place your queen on e7. So that's what I did, and now my opponent plays c3. Now instead of c3, in one game one of my opponent plays knight to f3, and I simply played knight cross e4, and after bishop cross and queen cross, please remember this bishop is covering the vital even square. So my opponent plays c3, and his idea was now he wants to play the rook to e1, but when you place f4, this is the thing that goes into the favor for the black. So I simply give this check, bishop c5, and after king to h1, I simply castle on the king side, and here white has nothing but a pawn down situation. So if your opponent plays knight to f3, this is how you can handle. That's why at this position my opponent plays c3, and after bishop to c5 check and king goes to the h1. As I mentioned in other video, that it's very hard for black to castle on the queen side because b4 and a4 are coming very quickly. So that's why I decided to castle on the king side, and now my opponent plays queen to e1. So planning is very simple. This queen wants to go either to g3 or to the h4 depending on the circumstances. So I played rook to e8, so pressurizing more to the e pawn, and now my opponent responded with b4, and after bishop to d6 my opponent plays bishop to b2. So finally he's developing his all pieces, and here I responded with a5, attacking the pawn, and he just protect that pawn one more time with the move a3. Now I place bishop to d7. So here black is also completing his all piece development. Now let's see how we are going to progress from here onwards. So in the game my opponent decided to play c4, which has a merit of attacking the knight and unleashing the bishop, and I responded with a cross b4, and after a cross b4 exchange one pair of rooks, so rook cross rook and bishop cross rook. Here I place knight to g4. Idea is very simple. I want to put the knight or the bishop on e3. So my opponent responded with rook to f3, stopping penetration on e3, and here I place f5. Please note white's e pawn is pinned right now, so my opponent responded here with the move h3, attacking my knight. But then after some calculation I goes for this sequence, so I place f cross e4, attacking two piece. So my opponent's response is pretty much forced. My opponent plays knight cross e4, and here I place bishop to c6. So now you can see three pieces are attacking the knight, and my opponent captured my knight, and I recaptured the knight with the bishop, and after bishop takes, queen takes, my opponent responded with queen to c3, which has a direct threat to mate me on g7. Here I responded with first of all this queen check, and after king to h2, bishop to g1 check, and after king to h3 I simply snap up the queen, and after my opponent recapture with the rook, I simplify more with bishop to d4, and after rook to c1, bishop takes bishop and rook takes bishop. I deliberately gone for the ending because I knew that this ending favors the black, and the reason is because of the black's next move, rook to e4. So you can see right now this rook is attacking f4 and c4, and white cannot defend both the pawn. So in the game my opponent responded with rook to a7, attacking my b7 pawn, but after rook cross f4, rook cross b7 and rook cross c4, black is clearly a pawn up, and in the game I managed to push my d pawn up to the board and win the game. So that is how you can play against knight to d2 system.